Grateful. So, to this evening's talk, Angela Oberer, who did a doctorate in Berlin at the Technical University there. She's an art historian, has been living in Florence for over 20 years, is a freelance lecturer around the multiple programs, including having done several years here on the British Institute History of Art program. A year ago, 18 months ago, she gave us a great lecture whilst we were still in Zoom-only mode because of the pandemic. That was all about the Gates of Paradise at the baptistry. It was a very fine lecture. So I said, Angela, you've got to come back. So she finally got back in Presenza as well as on the Zoom to talk about Rosalba Carriera, of which she is a real expert because she's about to publish a book all about it. And there's some flyers around so you can see what the book is called and place orders for your copies. So over to Angela.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much for your kind invitation and the kind introduction. Now, I'm actually very, very happy to be back because I had talked about Rosalba Carriera already years ago. And so many things have happened in the meantime that I'm very, very happy to be able to present something completely different. Completely different. So here you go. Numerous letters from Venice and from abroad bear witness to Rosalba Carriera's status in the 18th century. Unlike a lot of modern criticism, they contain boundless recognition and admiration. Everywhere hymns were sung in praise of her skill and her personality, often in lofty and impassioned language. I just show you one of the many self-portraits that we have. Quote, not without due cause is Signora Rosalba valued as an ornament of Italy and Europe's foremost female artist. She fills Europe with her works. Rosalba is one of the brightest lights in painting that your Italy has ever given us. She's the glory of her sex, the most talented female artist of our country, and so forth. While it is true that in the 18th century, we noticed for the first time a significant growth in the number of female artists in Europe, the fact that Carriera became that famous is literally unique. How did this actually happen? How did Carriera manage to not only enter the primarily male official art scene in Venice and abroad, but actually dominate it in her field? How did she grow from the white rose of Venice, Rosa Alba, white rose, to Europe's foremost female artist, as she was called during her lifetime? The first known artworks that Carriera produced were lids of tabatière, snuff boxes for tobacco, and other types of miniatures, an art form that gained popularity among the aristocracy starting in the 16th century. From France and England, practice arrived in Italy as well. And by the end of the 17th century, the small-scale paintings had become a trans-European idiom of intimacy. These are just two examples of snuff boxes that you have an idea. Like pieces of jewelry, their particularly extremely personal value for their owners turned them into deeply sentimental artifacts. Given their size, the miniatures were often enclosed in precious containers of gold and silver, like this one decorated with diamonds or other precious stones. Particularly clear crystal or glass covered the protected fragile miniatures, such as seen in this example. Although it is still uncertain through whom or how Carriera was introduced to this specific technique, she became a veritable expert in the genre, and soon even forgeries of her paintings circulated in Venice. What could have been the reasons for Carriera's decision to focus on this genre? First, it gave her slightly easier access to the artistic procession. Her contemporaries would regard this activity as a typically female genre, which thus did not risk her reputation. At the same time, it is reasonable to presume that her decision was effectively a clever strategy to forge ahead without the fear of serious rivalry. As noted by Vincenzo Maria Coronelli in his Traveler's Book from 1697, there were only 7 miniature painters in the city apart from Carriera and her sister Giovanna. For the guests in here who have listened to the other lecture, just reminding you that Rosalba was the firstborn daughter. About 2 years later, there's another daughter who's called Giovanna, and another 2 years later, there will be a third daughter called Angela. Rosalba teaches her sisters, but only Giovanna will actually continue to paint. She'll be the most important assistant in her workshop and live with her oldest sister for the rest of her life. So specializing in miniatures therefore meant occupying an almost empty niche in Venice. And equally important is the fact that Carriera's pursuit of the miniature genre meant she did not have to compete with those artists who earned their living as history painters executing altarpieces or frescoes for the local churches and palaces, like the Tiepolo example or this beautiful Piazza San Marco by Francesco Guardi. With miniature painters seen as not meeting the same intellectual and technical standards as history painters and thus having a lower profile, so not seen as part of the central art establishment, Carriera's male colleagues most likely never perceived her or her small-scale works as a professional threat. From a technical point of view, Carriera was also importantly the first artist to recognize the promising qualities of ivory as a medium for the tiny, intimate paintings. During her lifetime, she was the sole artist who single-handedly made the use of this material popular internationally. The more I looked at the miniatures, the more I was fascinated by her artistic inventions that reflect an intelligent, erudite, and original mind. And all of that, I admit, it came a bit as a surprise to me to realize that apart from portraits and allegories, she produced a significant number of erotic or eroticizing miniatures. Erotic subjects, whether in mythological disguise, tied to Arcadian visions, or veiled behind the literary quotations, appear predominantly in Carriera's miniatures, and this is probably no coincidence when considering that the delicate tiny artworks were mainly intended for private viewing. The miniature of a girl with a basket of strawberries is just one example of the subject matter that Carriera painted regularly. Images of rural shepherdesses and gardeners wearing countrified costumes and straw hats, complemented by baskets of fruit or vegetables. In this case, the key to read the miniature lies in the basket and the fruit. Since the Renaissance, strawberries have been associated with virgin blood, visually and metaphorically. Shakespeare, for example, used the metaphor in his sonnet Venus and Adonis, where he stated, quote, "Or as the berry breaks before its dame," end quote. Furthermore, the plant itself was part of the generic rose family, the flower most frequently connected with love and desire. Carriera's girl is uncovering the bright red strawberries in her basket previously protected by a white piece of cloth, a gesture that corresponds to her losing her virginity. To convey the full intensity of this miniature's erotic charge, we might remember that Elizabethan gardeners considered the strawberry as the purest of the fruits. The treble-leaved strawberry plant bore of red fruit from its initially white flower. The following piece shows the seated goddess of love and beauty embracing her son, who is standing next to her, playing with a bird on a leash. Venus, barely covered, is looking longingly at the bird while she's tickling the nipple of her left breast, a gesture that adds to the depiction of erotic charge. Cupid, on the other hand, is apparently unaware of his mother's delight and follows the flight of his companion. In depicting Venus in the company of Cupid, Carriera followed the general iconography of the goddess of love as it had been known inside and out in Italy, since the Renaissance. Even so, the addition of the rather unusual bird on the string is a striking departure from tradition. Carriera could have counted on current general understanding of the bird as a widely used emblem of male sexuality, the phallus, and sexual intercourse. Even today, the Italian word uccello is used as a euphemism for the male member. In Carriera's painting, the longing goddess is enchanted by what she is craving, but she has no power to control the flight of the bird. It is her son who is holding the leash. It is he who can permit the bird to fly or not. And at the same time, I think it was also a very witty adaptation of this painting by Veronese nowadays in Vienna. If you look at the gestures, if you look at the position, and especially also if you look at Cupid with the blonde curly hair, there an entire discourse would have to follow on the importance of Veronese in the 18th century. That became again a kind of a Veronese fever. So again, a witty adaptation, I think. The haptic aspect of miniatures that went along with the viewer holding the painting in his or her hands, moving it closer to the eyes, literally handling of the pieces, is a fundamental aspect of the genre. and is particularly pronounced in one of the most fascinating miniatures Carriera ever produced, I think. Françoise Marie du Bourbon as Amphitrite. Françoise Marie du Bourbon was one of the 7 children whom Louis XIV had with his mistress known as Madame ou Marquise de Montespan. Aged 14, Françoise Marie married her cousin, Philip II d'Orléans, Duke of Chartres, who was the future regent in France until Louis XV reached maturity at the age of 13. Carriera was inspired by a painting entitled Galatea triumphant in Versailles. However, in her miniature, Carriera concentrated on only Amphitrite and the 2 nymphs. The women are shown in a titillating close-up of 3 half-figures intertwined in an erotic embrace. By the way, also a clear reference to the mythological 3 Graces. While the 18th century produced a vast array of erotic images in erotic literature that was consumed by men and women, the depiction of sapphic love remained a somewhat vague theme. During the Middle Ages and until the Renaissance, the debate about homosexuality regarded primarily male relationships. In Florence, for example, where thousands of men were killed for acts of sodomy during the 15th century, there is no surviving evidence of the prosecution of sexual encounters between women. Female homosexuality was less threatening to the patrimony since reproduction, paternity, and legitimacy were not at issue. This form of invisibility slowly changed during the Renaissance, when images of women bathing together and touching each other appeared. Most typically, like in this example, in mythological figures like Diana and her nymphs. In a kind of a twist that mingles power dynamic and cross-identification, these depictions included the exploitation of the myth of Callisto. I'm showing you one example here, in this case by François Boucher. Although Ovid's Metamorphoses recounts a sexual encounter between male Jupiter and female Callisto, it was part of the same process of cultural negotiation of same-gender female love as the nymph was seen and seduced and raped by Jupiter in the shape and disguise of Diana. Paintings focusing on the moment of her seduction simultaneously highlight the pastoral sensuality and the overt erotic attraction between 2 females, as the scene is often devoid of any iconographic encoding of Jupiter. In Carriera's miniature, the onlooker cannot find the traditional mythological justification. The artist offers no clear hints that would identify or define the broader context of this all-female gathering. It is only the clothes that create some kind of timely distance. Instead of wearing 18th century dresses, the figures are attired in the pseudo-ancient garments that Carriera used in mythological or allegorical scenes. In the miniature, Madame de Bois is looking straight into the eyes of the beholder, who's drawn into a gazing game where glances oscillate between the protagonist, the viewer, and the other 2 women. At the same time, Madame de Blois seems to invite the onlooker to participate. While the Duchess is flirting with the beholder, the woman on the right is embracing her with her right arm while the left arm is bent. It is not possible to see where her left hand is placed. It is left to the onlooker's fantasy to decide. The same woman is looking down to the 3rd figure, who is depicted on a lower level and differentiated by her dark tresses. She has turned her back to the viewer and her face is close to Madame de Blois' breast, leaving little to the imagination as to what she is doing. It would be hard to find another example in pre-18th century European art in which 3 women without mythological disguise are depicted in such a startling and overt visualization of all-female eroticism. Equally important in this context is to analyze, though, how Carriera managed to blend the subject-object realities. The position of the black-haired woman in the center of the miniature corresponds to the position of the person who is holding it close to his or her eye. If one imagines the viewer visually enjoying the small-scale painting but also kissing it, a practice recorded regularly in the history of miniatures, Carriera's composition proves to be much more than the result of a refined aesthetic and artistic choice. The holding and potentially kissing of the miniature are not visualized, but implied in the composition of the figures, I argue. The artist deftly mingles the internal and the external realities of her artwork. Subject and object are intrinsically intertwined. The fact that we have documents that describe how Carriera's male clients received these kind of pieces was another really surprising result to me of my research. Now I'm showing you this Venus here, which is not the one described in the text that I'm about to read, but just to give you an idea. We do not know exactly which miniature the author is referring to, but to give you an idea. When Carriera sent a miniature depicting a Venus to Louis Vatin at the start of the 18th century, the French art collector recorded his reaction to the piece in 1701. "I feel again the violence of a curious desire. My charming nude with coral lips on the shore of a stream of a liquid crystal, your divine attractions I will enjoy, and even if you can neither see nor hear me, Venus, oh beautiful Venus, from the bottom of my heart, I tell you, she who formed you, being a woman of virtue, she made you after her wish and mine. And when upon my return I can possess you, I could never, oh beauty, ever desire else." End quote. Another captivating piece of evidence of how Carriera's clients reacted to the art can be found in a letter that Gerhard Michael Jabach sent to the artist from Cologne. Even though Jabach had not yet seen the final version of what he called La Belle, he already seemed to be in love with the woman of his fantasy. Simply imagining the miniature made him dream and talk about this female figure depicted as if she were a real human being, a living companion. Quote, "She's always beautiful, always full of wit, always lovable, and she will never know how to be otherwise. She will often be my pastime, talking to me in her sweet language, in her eyes that express often more than words can say. She will make my tobacco pretty, and my tabatière will become illustrious and precious." End quote. Giorgio Maria Rapparini, Carriera's intermediary with the court of Düsseldorf, also described his relationship with one of her miniatures along passionate lines. In July 1709, he described the satisfaction he simply felt by imagining La Mia Contadina that he had commissioned. As soon as he had notice of his peasant woman being on her way, his expectations reached a first peak before even having seen the final product. He wrote that he would receive a woman so beautiful that she would tempt even the most disaffected men, I più ribelli del sesso, is the Italian. About a year later, in October 1710, Rapparini sent another thank you note to Carriera after having received a beautiful nymph, so another piece, by her hand. His letter represents an excellent example of how collectors and lovers of miniatures enjoyed every second while literally handling their beloved painting. He convincingly described the joy of unlocking the box containing the nymph so as to assure Carriera that he liked what was inside, even before lifting the lid. In a crescendo, he then stressed how much greater this excitement was when he finally looked at La Bella Nympha. And the same will be true for pastels. Again, it is Rapparini who most openly acknowledged his pleasure when he looked at the pastel he had just received. Healthy and rubicund, and with a mien from paradise, this most delicate pastel has arrived, not in any way fatigued by the trip, and without suffering in the least. Not has any harm come to the beautiful nudity of her breast from the vigorous cold of the season. And he continues, "Oh, what a beautiful virgin! This appearance has made me, a man over 40, feel again the sting of love's arrow. Oh, what..." Exactly. "Oh, what a taste! Oh, what touches! Oh, what harmony! This has life and blood running through her veins." The passion awakened in Rapparini by the painting culminates in the wish to come together with his wife as soon as possible. First, to make her look at the painting, and then, with her remembering every part of it, to produce their next child, whose beauty would be influenced by the glorious piece of art. It was common belief since antiquity that if pregnant women looked at a beautiful thing or things or edifying art, the fetus in their womb had better chances of being of gentle nature and beautiful. In this sense, he wrote to Carriera that he had decided to hang it in the bedroom, quote, right next to the bed, that she, his wife, may grasp this form in her mind now that we are imminently about to undertake the manufacture of our tin puppet. It sounds even better in Italian when he says, perché pisi quelle forme in mente, ora che si darà opera immediata alla fabbrica del 10° burattino. It's, amazing. So that we don't have the precise pastel, but I want to show you this pastel, which is an exquisite piece in Chicago, one of the most beautiful ones that I know, where again, there's an entire discourse to be made about the eroticism of the piece. It's actually quite obvious, but the more you look at it, the more you find, the parrot that is opening the shirt, she's already almost naked right in front of you. So there is a lot to study still. Around the year 1700, changes can be noticed in Carriera's life. Her family moves into the Palazzo on the Grand Canal, and for the Venice fans, they recognize probably that is right next to the Guggenheim Museum, which I always find very beautiful that these two women, they had their houses obviously in different time periods, but right next to each other. So they moved into this Palazzo. In the same year, she started to collect her correspondence, and on the left-hand side, I'm showing you just one of the 2 volumes that Bernardina Sani published in 1985. Imagine we have over 800 pages of documents edited by Bernardina Sani, to whom I'm eternally grateful for doing this. And that, you can probably imagine, is a treasure that is immense. From the top of my head, I cannot think of any other artist, leave alone women artist, where you have that many documents, that are of all different types, most of them correspondence, but then she also had various pages of diaries. Unfortunately, I think for not many years, I would have preferred having more diary entries for her, but it still is something that is amazing. So she started collecting her correspondence in the year 1700, and it was also the period in which she starts discovering, pastel painting. So she now starts with a new technique. And similarly to miniature painting, this new technique meant not to get into any rivalry with her male colleagues, who continued to concentrate on fresco and oil. Again, she found and occupied a niche for herself. And again, she proved to be particularly original, erudite, and intelligent in her artistic inventions. Now, the following example that I'm showing you is the reception piece that Rosalba Carriera sent to Paris when she was accepted at the Parisian Art Academy. She manages to stay in Venice and live in Venice for almost completely all of her life. She only has 3 little trips, one to Paris in 1720, 1723, Modena, and then the Imperial Court in Vienna in 1730. For the rest of her life, she stays, lives, and works in Venice. And so when she was received as the first, foreign woman artist in the Parisian Academy, which was an incredible event, when she went home, the Parisian Academy obviously wanted to have a reception piece, which then they would put on display in Naples. It takes her a long time to actually send it, so the Academy they start becoming a little bit impatient about the whole thing, and then she does something which is incredible, I think. First thing she does, to show you the various layers, that you can find in her work, that actually, again, I'm convinced shows how intelligent and how erudite this woman was. First thing she does, she sends a letter to the Academy, describing what she was going to be sending, what she was working on. Sorry. What does that mean? It means that she very clearly makes reference to something that we call ekphrasis. Ekphrasis is a description of visual art. It is the comparison at the same time between writing, and painting. So the verbal and the visual. I don't think that was a coincidence. That is a very clever way of introducing her at the same time as an author and a painter. And again, after receiving the letter, when the pastel finally arrived, they could say, oh, that's a nice description, but it's so much better what she did, So also this surprise. Second thing, I wondered, why did she actually choose this? Rosalba, nymph in the retinue of Apollo. Okay, France, Paris, the Sun King. Apollo is a subject matter which is part of the traditional iconography in Paris. So that was pretty easy, and that makes sense because that would resonate with her French colleagues and the French people in general. But she doesn't depict Apollo. She just puts him in the title. She reduces the whole thing to a completely and singularly female scene. So I thought, okay, that is already an interesting fact. Do we have an example that she could make reference to maybe in Paris? And the first thing, not the first thing, but I eventually looked at Apollo and the nymphs because that's in her title. And the first thing I saw was, of course, this very famous marble group in the Gardens of Versailles, which already at the beginning of the 18th century this was enormously famous. At this point, the group had been described. There had been writings, there had been prints, they had been discussing it. It was generally accepted to be the most beautiful marble group in the entire gardens, and if you look at this nymph, I thought, I think that's exactly what she did. She actually makes reference to a French piece of art, which again would resonate with the French. It's almost like a flattering gesture towards the French, but then at the same time, the way that she's depicted with this index, there's one artwork that is always very clearly almost identified, I would say, it might be exaggerated, with this index going up. Okay, and Leonardo da Vinci's St. John the Baptist was in Paris, and at that point, she actually turns it into Italy against France, because now she actually very clearly shows the Italian great master of the Italian Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci. But at the same time, I think, I can't prove that, but I think that's what was going on. I actually think that also on a conceptual level, it works out really well, because St. John the Baptist, is the last prophet, the prophet that indicates, the arrival of salvation, the arrival of Christ, the divine and the human nature of Christ that actually promises salvation. And the nymph is the prophetess, with her index that actually indicates Mount Parnassus, the Apollonian temple, the apotheosis for any artist, to be received there. So the human and the divine nature of a painter, and she's obviously now part of it because she's now part of the academy. So these various layers are all included in there, and she just presents it very softly to the Parisians, and they love her. She actually receives wonderful critiques in Paris, but I think that is the most interesting example to show on the various layers that Rosalba Carriera was able to work. I said she discovered pastel painting, so going back to pastel painting also meant that there was no physical strain for herself or her clients. Seemingly endless and tiresome sittings could be avoided. There was no exposure to chemicals with strong and unpleasant odors, so another series of advantages for her to use that technique. On top of that, by the end of the 17th century and during the first 30 years of the 18th century, Venetian painters complained about their hometown hemorrhaging artists to foreign lands. And it is true that in the 17th and still at the beginning of the 18th century, a painter who aimed to have a secure, guaranteed income was obliged, or was thought to be obliged, to travel, creating a talent drain in the city. But Carriera, unlike many of her illustrious male colleagues, managed to stay and work most of her life in the lagoon city, making much more than just a living. She cleverly knew to use the specific situation of Venice tourists. Carriera capitalized on that potential more, or at least in a more fruitful way than any of her contemporary colleagues. And this clientele, especially the French and the English, were not only more interested in miniatures, but also showed a more profound appreciation of portraits in miniature and in pastel than the Venetians did. While in England, portraiture in any format had turned into the most important and most popular genre at the time, it was not nearly as popular on the peninsula. The Italians had a reputation for showing little interest in portraiture, even in the form of miniatures. In a city where foreigners at the beginning of the 18th century numbered between 30,000 and 40,000, which included residents and travelers, she knew how to profit from their presence in the city, cultivating special relationships with intellectuals, artists, aristocrats, rich rulers, and their agents. In this situation, it was an enormous advantage to produce easily portable art on the spot. The multitude of tourists could commission a miniature or a pastel and on departure take the easily transportable work of art home with them, either as a memento or a display of material wealth. Being small in size, such paintings could also be sent by post or courier service at a reasonable price after the clients had left the city. And it created a situation for Carriera that meant freedom. To avoid the risks of becoming financially dependent or of losing her artistic independence, which at any European court could easily have been her fate, Carriera did not submit herself to being supported by a fixed patron in Venice or abroad. She refused to leave the home city to take up lucrative offers from foreign rules, and she did get them. Eventually, she managed to create for herself the singular position of not being forced to find her clients. Her customers found her on the free market. Indeed, they competed for her favor. And the result was what I called the importance of owning a carriera. Her name eventually became so renowned throughout Europe that it not only gave rise to a new fashion in the art world, but even introduced new aesthetic conventions. Ownership of a work of art by Carriera became more important than either the subject of the piece or the medium she used. The ambition to possess, the urge to own one of her paintings grew to the point where customers would take whatever they could get. As in her career, Carriera chose independence in her private life, remaining alone and never marrying. It was a choice that made her part of a tiny minority, the society she lived in. Fewer than 10% of 18th century women remained spinsters. Nevertheless, among the group of female artists, she took on quite a representative role, as the 17th and 18th centuries produced a striking number of female painters who also remained unmarried. Remaining single meant, swimming against established conventions, it compelled her to promote a role and an identity for a social group that was not officially acknowledged. It also entailed renouncing the predefined role of a wife who receives financial and social support and protection from her husband. It was a decision accompanied by potential intimidation. Community morality could be stained, so societal expectations exerted pressure. Family honor could be compromised, and estate succession was at stake. It is impossible to ascertain whether Carriera's decision not to marry was the result of her aspiration to be an emancipated, independent woman, or because of her sexual orientation. Either conjecture would distract attention from one highly significant fact: marriage was never a real alternative for her. For female artists of her time, marriage was a means of climbing the social ladder. As a means of climbing the social ladder was only conditionally possible. Generally speaking, the professional career of the woman artist was hampered rather than helped by marriage. And as a consequence, many women artists, once married, more often than not abandoned their profession. Carriera's career would have been obstructed quite considerably by marriage. Actually, had she married, it would have been her husband, not she, who would have benefited from her fame. By renouncing marriage, on the other hand, she was able to safeguard her intellectual and artistic autonomy, which compensated for the loss of social advancement. Simply put, as Chambers Schiller's book title suggests, liberty, a better husband. Her decision to remain single led Carriera to build and rely on a functioning network of prominent and influential men and women in her hometown and abroad. Representatives from all spheres of influence substituted the husband for social leverage, a system that worked exceptionally well, especially since her friends and acquaintances included ambassadors, intellectuals, aristocrats, businessmen, artists of both sexes. Carriera managed to interact with them at various levels, whether in person, at her home, during social events, or evenings at the theater, the opera, or through her fervent correspondence. Furthermore, it would appear that Carriera sought to overcome prejudices and difficulties regarding her lifestyle without excessively pushing the boundaries of societal expectation. To do so, the single woman Carriera recognized that she would have to behave impeccably and employ some clever tactics. One of her strategies to become omnipotent in Venice, as was written to her in one of the letters, was to fashion a niche and create a certain image of herself. Playing on the gender stereotypes of her time, she consciously propagated an unattractive picture of herself as a busy, inflexible, cold woman, the conventional image of an old spinster. Now, this was part of the last lecture that I did, so I'm not going to repeat this anymore. I just want to show you the self-portrait in the Uffizi, where you can see her standing there. She's showing what she's doing with the pastel, probably her sister Giovanna. She has a little white rose in her in the hair, you know, as Rosalba to actually identify her. But she doesn't really quite look at you. She's almost kind of modest, you know, in the appearance, and tries to almost step back behind her own image. Compared, you know, to this very spontaneous sketch, which is nowadays in Berlin, I think we can easily see the difference. You know, that's Rosalba Carriera, but she can't sell that. You know, she has to sell something else, I think. So, a side note, as it was virtually impossible for her as a female artist to promote and advertise herself, which for women of her time was seen as unfeminine and indecorous, self-portraits always offered a great possibility to literally show and self-fashion themselves. These are two other examples of the self-portraits. The one on the right-hand side is the last one she produced. That was towards the end of her life. She fortunately gets cataracts and she'll turn blind. And so that is the first one, the last one that we have. Another self-portrait with a very profound meaning, you know, behind, where she actually, at that point, she doesn't have to put out any mascara anymore. That's her, you know, the empress of art, so to speak. But apart from the Uffizi self-portrait, surviving documents further support the idea that Carriera deliberately leveraged her status as an unwed woman by cultivating her image as a fragile, modest, homely spinster. This carefully constructed masquerade offered her both liberty and a potent shield, with one consequence of her efforts being the presumption by others that she was a virginal celibate woman who lived the exemplary life of a holy painter. Consequently, Carriera was commonly linked with sainthood, and to the extent to which others used religious vocabulary and ideas in relation to the artist is rather noteworthy. You know, only 3 examples, but heaven had destined her for more elevated things. You appear a heavenly woman, an earthly goddess. Blessed be the hand that has handled the brush so well in outlining so well the holy image of the divine Savior. Tell me, have you seen our Lord in some rapture of the spirit, really like a saint? Another clever strategy Carriera used was downplaying or veiling the financial success of her professional life. Fame and glory, or ambition and success, were dubious goals or qualities for a woman at the time. And accordingly, Carriera made sure that she acted in line with society's expectations of her being a modest and humble lady. This somewhat curious aspect becomes evident from an analysis of her correspondence. Her business letters do not contain personal details, and interestingly, they rarely refer directly to financial matters. She presented herself to the world as a woman who was taking care of her family, focusing on her idealized, purified work, untouched by dishonorable motives like money. It seems she consciously and deftly played any interest that she, as an independent artist, would have had in earning a living. Crude, common monetary concerns did not fit in with her image, so they were ignored. This well-considered strategy becomes evident when one looks at Carriera's diaries, where financial affairs play a far larger role, and where there are often minute details regarding money issues. Carriera's cautiously constructed persona, her caution, tactics, and the control of her behavior worked out remarkably well if one takes into account that there's no evidence to date of any specific public criticism of her private life, her reputation, or her morals. For an artist of an international renown, someone whom people talked about at the various European courts, who received a manifold clientele from an impressive number of different countries, France, England, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Italy, and who worked in a city where she would have easily become the target of envious local painters, it is noteworthy that she managed to live a relatively undisturbed life. One last aspect I would like to mention as far as her success is concerned. In surprising contrast to the enthusiastic reception of Carriera's work by her contemporaries, I mentioned them at the beginning of this talk, 20th century literature on Carriera tended for a long time to either completely negate or at least downplay her talents as a portraitist. They emphasized the decorativeness of her works over the characterization of the figures and the standardization of her images of the 18th century ideal of female beauty over the individuality of the women she depicted. Just another slide. At the beginning of the 20th century, authors like Lothar Brieger went so far as to castigate Carriera for her spiritless, expressionless faces that border on depictions of rigor mortis, the outstanding poverty of soul and lack of liveliness and coldness of her sitter, still according to Brieger, turned the artist into the one who had ruined pastel painting in general. Even if this comment represents probably the most extreme negative opinion regarding Carriera's work, critics like Gino da Merini in his Pittori Veneziani del Settecento judges her art to be superficial and banal. Jacques Wilhelm and even Michael Levy in the 1980s still, who adopts a condescending tone in speaking of her artificial mask-like faces and unconventional compositions, each tend to criticize primarily her charming idealization, flattering, banal beautification of her depictions of women. So how can we explain that phenomenon? The dichotomy between the enthusiasm of Carriera's contemporaries and the harsh critique by modern art historians. Why were her clients not disappointed or even disturbed by a certain repetitiveness, which does exist, and lack of expression, the way the 20th century onlooker did? First, we have to put Carriera's conception of idealization in the context of 18th century and the social norms relating to individual appearance. The elaborate conformity to the fashion of the moment, the attempt to look like everybody, but slightly different, and an artificiality in the creation of a self or a second self adhered to an elitist notion of decent representation and longed for recognition. They were standards to follow and proof of one's capacity to find ornamentation within the system. One result of this attitude was a widely accepted manipulation and control of one's face, aided with the help of clearly visible cosmetics. And it's precisely these works of art, so to speak, that Carriera depicted and represented in a fair number of her pastel portraits as representatives of idealized uniform beauty. It seems not too far-fetched to hypothesize that many of her female clients would have indeed preferred to be portrayed in a charming, flattering way. I think, though, that her images might contain some other level of meaning. Carriera's formula, insofar as it was a formula that differentiated those images clearly from a more realistic rendering of the sitter, were part of a group identification that I called the Carriera mask. Her female clients, who finally had their own stage by being depicted independently of their husband in pendant portraits, were eager to be shown as belonging to a certain social class, as corresponding to a certain ideal of beauty that was more important than a true likeness. Appearance was codified in a visual déjà vu that included recognizability, fashionable clothes, expensive jewelry, which substituted for the need to be identified through facial features. Above, I have mentioned the importance of owning a Carriera. The significance of her pastels is reflected in the fact that it had become a must to put Carriera on display in any sophisticated household, and to be represented in such a piece would mobilitate the sitter automatically. And I'm showing you this painting I came across, and I said, oh my gosh, there's a Carriera. In this household, I looked it up. I was pretty sure I wouldn't find it, but just for the heck of it, I looked it up and tried to see if there is a pastel in the until now only existing catalog raisonné that looks like this. I didn't, but then I thought, no, it doesn't have to. It is a recognizable Carriera. And that, I think, is exactly the reason why they didn't complain, but felt to be part of this elitist group. Appearing on a pastel by Carriera, these women became part of a unified group of equals, which bestowed a special status on them, as such as a status that required a correspondence with an ideal of beauty, but that was created by being a Carriera. Her paintings had more and more gained the status of their own, and so did the women depicted in them. To be portrayed by the Venetian artist in a recognizable Carriera way created a sense of collective identity, a reason for which I called the Carriera mask was voluntarily accepted. Being a Carriera meant automatically being part of exclusive group of women of a visual community. It implied an elevated social and cultural status, refined manners, exclusive taste, as well as outstanding beauty. A gorgeous physical appearance that corresponded to the ideal of beauty at the time, further signified femininity, virtuousness, and more importantly, the public prominence of the women. From the importance of owning a carriera to the importance of being a carriera. And I think all of this put together is very difficult to be topped by any other woman artist until that period. What I showed you today, basically, this is the conclusion. That's all I put together today. She was a trendsetter in technique and style, which is very rare for women artists. In style maybe, but in technique, I'm referring to the ivory. She is the one who actually sparked off the fashion of pastel portraits all over Europe. She became member of 3 art academies in Rome, in Bologna, and in Paris. She was this erudite, intelligent artist that I tried to show you in which ways, she was actually creating her artworks. From the importance of owning a carriera to being a carriera, what we just talked about. She was probably at least one of the most famous women artists in the 18th century. And some of the clever techniques, tactics we discussed tonight. So if there's anybody in here who's looking for a research project, I really do invite you to join in, because this is really just the beginning. Nothing of this has ever been discussed. Nothing. Carriera until now, basically had been regarded this famous pastelist, but there was no real approach to trying to understand what is actually depicted there. What do these paintings really show? So again, really, if you know anybody who wants to do research, throw Rosalba out to them, because they'll find a lot. There's really hardly anything out there yet, which is surprising. And a final remark, the British Institute with Simon Gell invited me to talk about Carriera, and I'm thankful for this, because I wanted to present all these examples. Calliope and Margie McKinnon, showed sincere interest and generously sponsored this event. Linda Falcone, whom I'm sure everybody knows in here, and the Restoration Conversations magazine is interested in the subject. Roland Enke right now is preparing the first exhibition on the Carriera in the Gemäldegalerie in Dresden. That is, the museum has the biggest collection of Carriera works in the world. They have never had an exhibition. And so finally there it's coming up. Elegant Encounters is called. It's opening on June 9. And so if anybody is traveling to Germany, it's not too far away from Berlin, so you can actually join. Please go, because you will never see that many pieces by this incredible woman ever. And on top of that, Lantern Phrase in London has accepted Rosalba Carriera to be included in the series of illuminating women artists. Co-publisher is the Getty in Los Angeles. So we're very, very happy that this is coming out. And I want to express my deepest gratitude to all of you, because helping to promote Rosalba Carriera only works if we work together. And we do, because you look at all these names, look at you here. You came to listen to what we have to say. And so thank you so much. And it's the 350th anniversary. So